All right, it's 11:05 Eastern. So we're just gonna get started now. Uh, Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Yehuda Kirschenbaum from TerraMind. Welcome to what, I hope will be a really engaging conversation. A lot of you have registered. So it seems like the topic is something that is interesting for you all. We're going to be talking about, how to empower the modern workforce, and build trust within your organization, but also securing that workforce as well. So, we've all watched the workplace transform in ways that none of us could have imagined. And we've been figuring this all out, the hybrid and remote thing together, sometimes successfully, sometimes, let's just say, there have been some learning moments along the way. Um, I'm really excited to have join us today CISO Ira Winkler. Ira, for those who are not familiar, is a noted cybersecurity expert and an author of several influential security books, including You Can Stop Stupid and Security Awareness for Dummies. I think that they might have been written about me. Um, we've received some great questions, and there, like I said earlier, there will be a Q&A session at the end. So add yours in the chat, and we'll hopefully get to all of them. Please get comfortable, and we'll get started just in a moment. Ira, great to have you here. Before we start, do you want to share a few words?
Yeah, so I'm Ira Winkler, CISO with Security. I would add that, frankly, relevant to what you said as a joke, is actually relevant to this conversation because when I talk about you can't stop stupid, stupid isn't the users. Stupid are the developers, administrators, all the people around the users who enable the users to cause harm. And that's the problem. It's not that the user is the weakest link. It's that the environment allows the user to be, for lack of a better term, the most vulnerable or prolific proximity of where an attack is. And the issue is that we have to look at the user as a part of the system.
Hmm.
And if a user fails, the system fails. And so if a user is stupid, it's not that the user is stupid, it's that the user allowed or the system allowed the user to appear to be stupid. And then at the same time, we also have to account for the user actually not being the user in many cases. So, like somebody takes over their account, and all of a sudden, the user, who you think is a nice, trusted, good person who they should be, is all of a sudden a bad person using the identity of somebody else. So we have to put systems in place that are proactively or stopping the user from being so vulnerable or being
Hmm.
the proximity of the attack. And likewise, we need to expect the user to do things, whether for good purposes or bad purposes, that they're not supposed to be doing, including proactively monitoring what they're doing so you could repair what they're doing. I'll leave it
Right.
there because I could go on for a while.
No, that's
But
that's actually that's great because it really does segue into this conversation about remote hybrid workforces. So, on that topic, right? What's the biggest shift that, you've seen, particularly with insider threats, since there's been this mass adoption of remote work or hybrid work?
So, one of the problems is that the infrastructures that we had were not necessarily tailored to remote work and detecting activities and things like that, where all of a sudden, you know, the people were within the perimeter and there was some element of protection being within a perimeter of some form. But then all of a sudden, remote work, especially after the COVID situation, all of a sudden they had to basically throw open the doors for people to act remotely, which a lot of organizations are not necessarily, were not ready for lack of a better way of phrasing it. And then that created this environment where the whole risk infrastructure was thrown out because it was inappropriate for the circumstances that were going on.
Right.
So that was another case. And then, with that, and given the again, all of the phishing that's been growing and everything over time, the compromise of identity, which happens, a lot of times people who are trusting of their insiders and for normally good reasons are ignoring the possibility that their good insiders' identity has been compromised by outsiders, which especially given I mean, phishing has always been a problem, but it's become much more of a proliferated problem because of remote work and everything else. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, and that also again it segues into the next question because, like you said, most of the people that are insiders are people that we've trusted, right? We've hired these people, we've vetted these people. They've joined our organization. They've gone through a process of you know background checks and all that. So, you know, how has the definition of insider threat kind of expanded beyond malicious actor, right? So you just mentioned how, somebody could have been taken advantage through a phishing scheme of some sort.
So again, the problem is we're always looking at there's this concept of malicious versus malignant that most people don't acknowledge. Malicious implies a bad person or somebody does things out of malice because they are just a bad person. Roughly 3 to 5% of the population are sociopaths or psychopaths. These people will do harm or do something that is in their interest as opposed to yours whenever given the opportunity. And they think they can get away with it. That's number one. However, at the same time, people are ignoring the malignant threats. Malignant threats are essentially things that happen on a regular basis that people accept as just, oh, well, gee, I accidentally lost a USB drive or something like that. The iconic example of malicious versus malignant after the September 11th attacks, where everybody was concerned about terrorism as a whole, what happened was all of a sudden Homeland Security, like on the sides of trains, you might see these placards that have numbers, and these numbers indicate what's inside, well, not just the trains but trucks.
Right.
And somebody from Homeland Security said, okay, we want those placards off of trains because if terrorists want to blow up a train car, they'll know exactly which car contains chlorine gas in the middle of a
Right.
big city. And then the first responders are like, are you out of your mind? You're worried about an isolated terrorist incident, which has never happened to date, while we are dealing with train derailments, which happen almost every day.
Right.
And we need to know immediately what's on the side of those cards. So that's an example of people over concerned about malicious concerns while ignoring the malignant that happens all the time. And users just, I don't know about you, but I've accidentally made massive mistakes throughout my career. And back in my Unix administrator days, rm minus r subdirectory star dot star dot star. If I forgot the name of the subdirectory accidentally and just typed quickly, all of a sudden I deleted the entire directory and prayed we had good backups, just as an example. So we got to worry about the malignant threats that users just accidentally cause.
Right. And there's that balance between, like you said, making a mistake where someone just, pushed the wrong button and I've done that before. Not a developer standpoint, but I once activated a coupon code on a website that gave everybody 80% off for a few hours before it was detected. So,
Well, we
you
also
know,
have,
yeah,
just to interrupt, we also have a big concern, our business email compromises, which, for example, if I'm going to type in, well, let's face it, Ira and Hootie are not popular names. But if, there have been times where you type something into Michael and the wrong Michael just autofills in the
right.
recipient field, and you go out and the wrong Michael might get sensitive data. I had one case where a former employee of mine asked one of my vendors for data for their new company or a bid for their new company.
Yeah,
And the person from the vendor just prepared a proposal and typed in the name of my former employee, I
Right.
guess expecting it to go to her new employment. Instead, it went to her current employment. And because of processes, we had her email just go to the general inbox to be, observed and see if we need to take action just because people are reaching out to her for our company business purposes. So
Yeah.
we then saw what our competitors were offering because of cases like that.
Wow. Yeah, and that we've all been there, we've all made those mistakes, but like you said, it's about building the trust within your organization and understanding that that occurrence might have been purely an accident and like you said, not malicious, but malignant or negligent by any stretch. So kind of going into that trust versus security, right? So there's often the perceived conflict between employee monitoring solutions and workplace trust. And when you're having the conversation with leadership, how would you frame that conversation to kind of balance that between monitoring and trust?
So, I mean, I like to stick fundamentally with facts.
Hmm.
Fundamentally, the company has the right to monitor what happens on their computer systems within laws. Most companies should have policies which basically say on company computing resources, we have the full ability, or we have not the ability, but the right. And frankly, I don't need to, you might want to mention responsibility to monitor what employees are doing for, frankly, the protection of the organization as well as the customers. Because what happens, and this is just a case, but what happens if you're in a financial organization
Right,
and an employee accidentally sends out a list of customer information with PII, whether intentional or not? You
right,
need to understand that some monitoring is in place, not for the specific purpose of, detecting and nailing employees, but for protecting the customers,
right,
protecting the client, protecting business assets. And the fact of the matter is that, frankly, most organizations I deal with have a responsibility to monitor, for example, outgoing email. Data leak prevention is embedded with everything else. We have users potentially having the ability to download ransomware,
mhm,
things in their emails and stuff, which needs to be looked at. We need to ensure customer policies are in place. People these days, again, if people are involved in criminal activity such as child pornography, that can't exist on top of, that can't exist on top of a valid organization because
right.
computers can be confiscated. There is a legitimate responsibility for companies to monitor, and they do have the right to do it. And if employees don't like it because there's this impression, I mean, frankly, they're monitored in everything else they do, and maybe just some education would help. I realize that's a Pollyanna answer, but
No, but
it is a very
you're right.
legitimate one that needs.
You're right about that, right? And sometimes that the way that it's communicated needs to be adjusted, and the way that what companies are doing and organizations why they are undertaking this monitoring or it's for the protection not just of the organization but also of the customers. So you know, there is still those people. So, for example, a company that didn't have a solution like this and now are going to be transitioning to that space to where they're going to start, monitoring employees for whatever reason. They might understand that security aspect, but they also might feel like there's the resistance. They might still be resistant to getting monitored. So I think it's called the privacy paradox. You know, what what do you think is the best way to communicate to employees, right? We talked about talking to leadership and understanding the importance of that, but now communicating to employees who might be much more resistant.
So this sounds bad as it comes out of my mouth, but it's a fact.
Yeah,
Employee monitoring is not something that resistance, I mean, I hate to say it, resistance is futile. If you install a monitoring tool on a company based computer, then it is just there doing its job. I
Mhm.
mean, in many cases, frankly, I don't even know if you have to inform people of new security tools that are being put in place. Because if you have a tool that is relatively invisible, you're basically installing a new tool that is invisible to the user, that is frankly allowed by policy, procedure, and everything else, which they should know, or at least they have agreed to, and hopefully you have the proper policies in place that
Right.
have identified that employee monitoring of their computer resources is a part of their process, whether it was previously implemented or not. It was
Correct.
still addressed to them, and it's, whether or not they need to be addressed, you might want to put an FAQ together
Hmm.
that says, look, are we doing this? It's like, no, we are not sitting there watching every keystroke you have. We have the
Right.
system set up for determining anomalous activities,
Yeah.
which is what the system does. That, you would go crazy if you're trying to monitor every employee for everything. The system has just been determined to go ahead and flag anomalous activities that possibly need to be addressed to protect you from creating damage, you from divulging your own information, because there is a benefit back to the employees as well,
Right.
because now you're preventing them from potentially creating harm and getting themselves fired. If somebody sends out PII as an example, and I use that because it's the most
Right.
blatant, that protects them. If they have an account takeover and you are detecting the fact that the account has been taken over, you're rapidly protecting the employee from any harm they could, that, or any, like, they could be fired depending on the nature of it if something happens on their account. And
Right.
by going ahead and proactively doing it, you are protecting the employees themselves. So again, there's a lot of hype surrounding this, but I
Yeah.
think addressing the facts, addressing positive use cases and how it helps protect them as well is going to be a concern, because people are watching things. Business email compromises happen.
Yeah.
Accounts are taken over.
And I think that when you talk about, traditional monitoring where it's just keystroke logging or just time check to make sure that you're, at your desk or doing your work, that's one thing. But, one of the things that we tout about Terramind is, we're able to really give you the context around the activities, not just the activities. And a lot of times we've had conversations with our customers that they've said that that aspect, the context, has really been able to support you know termination decisions or
Mhm.
save someone from being terminated based on the activity that was in question because they're able to see the full picture of the activity and understand. So this was, like you said, not malicious. This was a malignant thing or something that was by accident. And in turn, this monitoring software that people might be so concerned about actually just saved someone's position. So there definitely is that balance where, you said we're not watching every keystroke. That would be impossible. But we do use this for not just, security policy, but also to support our HR decisions. Uh, so, that it's something that, as you said, also, we do have those policies in place where, you're signing an employee agreement. It's probably in there. Double check it if you're concerned. But like you said, you're on a company device. The companies have the right to do this. So communicating the transparent, being transparent, I think is really going to be extremely helpful, and maybe reminding an employee about it every once in a while, or your team every once in a while might be take those steps to remind them of those of the reasons. The same way you would do like security and awareness training every
Mhm.
6 months or however much it is. Moving forward, before we move forward, I just want to remind everyone, if you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat. Not in the chat directly, we have a Q&A section, and we have someone who's moderating that. So if you do have a question, please take a minute and drop it in, and we'll hopefully get to that at the end of session. So moving on to kind of more best practices for and technical implementation. Um, you know, what are the most critical data points that organizations should be monitoring in the hybrid and remote work environment?
So generally, I look for anomalous activities first,
Hmm.
where if somebody is logging in from locations or times that they wouldn't normally be active, those are things that definitely need to be flagged. I mean, there was one time I was CISO of a company, and all of a sudden the stock manager sends me a message. It's like, Ira, are you in Greece? I'm like, ironically, I am. And it's
Yeah,
like, okay, that's a good thing that they determined this and picked it up.
right,
That they know I sometimes travel, and it was like, okay, great, my team did well and picked up anomalous activity. That was good. Other types of things are looking for data they don't normally look at, engaging in patterns of activity that they don't normally engage in, going to websites. You know, it's sort of like you have to determine the anomalous activities that exist. And then there's also other cases where sometimes you need to look for outliers of anomalous activities because an employee might do things consistently on a daily basis,
right.
and those could be bad things. So
Yeah,
we need to see where people within a given job function are normally doing it. So, for example, I was dealing with one organization, and it was common, for example, that in HR that they look at employee records.
right.
And so the average HR person was looking at maybe 5 to 6 people a day, and but somebody was looking at 30 to 40 people a
Well,
day. That's an example of a red flag.
yeah,
And you need to start doing that. Now, clearly, there are key, depending on how well you can monitor different patterns of activity to identify potentially a malicious person who has taken over an account, to look for changes in behavior is clearly something to consider. But you really just need to go ahead and set unusual activities. And it could be fundamentally with remote workforces. This has happened on way too many occasions. But you do have, for example, children all of a sudden using their parents' computer to
right,
access their schoolwork as an example, which, frankly, am I going to trust a school district with limited funding to protect their systems, their children, and everything else as well as I would expect my company to protect the computers? The answer is no. So you're looking at the potential for backdoors. So you need to understand where people are using their computers for, I don't want to say a backdoor, but where
right,
they're using it for unusual activity and things like that. Try to cut that down if they're allowing family members, if there's game activities and things like that. Not that that implies things, because I mean, I might do nothing during the course of most of the business day,
right,
but then I'll be working till 2 in the morning, because that's when my mind focuses better.
right,
And so you need to understand the difference, but you also need to understand that if I will using a work computer to go out and browse the internet and just space out and to find a new book on Amazon, that might not be the best use of my company computer.
right. And that's, so, just to kind of like tie a bow on what you were talking about is establishing a baseline of behavior so that you can really detect those anomalous activities, whether that's location or time, or websites like you said, because there is definitely going to be that opportunity where the kid is watching YouTube, and it's not that the person is uh, lazy or they just needed a break from their kid because their kid's home from whatever day off of school there is. Um, yeah, and I think that with the platform that we have at Terramind, we have all of these controls where you can set up very, very granular alerts and policies to monitor what is baseline, what is the person's normal behaviors, but also, if it's within a certain hour, right? So if it's between, your the regular 9 to 5 time, those websites will trigger an alert. But if it's outside of the working hours, they won't. So, setting up those types of, alerts and baseline activities to better understand your employees' activity, you'll be able to better identify, um, what's anomalous. Moving on. Um, so to talk about a little bit now, transitioning to compliance and risk management. Um, what's your advice for organizations trying to balance compliance requirements with workforce intelligence to kind of help boost productivity? Whereas
So, mhm.
Whereas
Oh,
like
go ahead.
security is used as a necessary tool, right? We need security in our organizations, but you know, we also want to enable our business to not just be stopped every, website we go to, or, if somebody needs to do research for whatever reason, right? There's different departments in every organization. Everybody else needs different access.
So, um, I always like, I wrote, I think I stole this from Marianne Davidson, the former CISO of Oracle, but, and this was way back when, like, this is like 3 decades now. Cybersecurity needs to be the department of how, not the department of no. And let me give you an example. I had a friend who he was CISO of a Fortune 30 company, and he had a board meeting. This was this was a couple decades ago, but it's a very iconic example. He was in a meeting where they said, we need people, we want to bring your own device policy where everybody uses their own mobile phones. Again, for right now, that's standard practice. But at the time, it was kind of on the newer side. And he's like, this can't be done securely. And then when the meeting breaks up, the CEO stops him from walking out of the room. He's like, I need to talk to you. He's like, here's the deal. You need to tell, in 2 weeks, you're going to tell me how we're going to use mobile devices securely. Or in 3 weeks, I'm going to have a new CISO. And because the problem is, it's not up to the cybersecurity team to say this can't be done. It's up to the cybersecurity team or leader, especially, to say, here, this creates a bunch of problems. And if here's how I would recommend we can do it as securely as possible, but you have to understand these are the risks you need to consciously accept. And the CISO was like, that was a learning experience for him. And the CEO was absolutely right, where he needed to go ahead and identify how to do something as securely as possible and identify the residual risk. Now, when we're talking compliance, compliance has different connotations. I always look at, there's a lot, I always found the problem in cybersecurity is that cybersecurity is considered a should and not a must, like I should be secure, not a must be secure, and that we tend to should all over ourselves. And so the problem is, or not the problem, but in many ways the benefit is compliance turns a should into a must. And people confuse compliance with being compliant as being as secure as possible. And part of the problem people have to understand is without compliance, most organizations might have nothing. And so compliance in the ideal world identify what in theory should be in place in a baseline security mechanism. And then, that's the start.
Right.
However, a lot of people, because I'll give another example, back when PCI was first rolling out, I was at the big RSA conference at the party they used to have. They used to have a big party for everyone. And then, I was there and I met a friend, and she was the CISO of a very large retailer. not Walmart where I used to work, but a very large retailer nonetheless. And I was talking to her, so how are things going? And she's like, do you know how hard it is to get, encryption for a mainframe? And I thought about it for a second because realizing PCI was coming down. I'm like, I have no sympathy for you. And she's like, why? What do you mean? I go, basically, what if I read through the lines, you're telling me you have a whole bunch of credit cards on your mainframe computers that are sitting there completely unencrypted. And they would have sat there completely unencrypted, despite the fact she was clearly an outstanding CISO to begin with, because she could not get the mandate to put encryption on those credit cards she's protecting. So compliance was very beneficial to getting a lot of good security in
Right.
place. So when we're talking compliance versus security, compliance needs to happen. Compliance is a must. And
Right.
fundamentally, a good cybersecurity professional should kind of help reinterpret compliance to be a little more secure than maybe
Yeah.
it has to, and then build on that. Sorry, I don't know
So
if I answered your question,
no,
but
no, for sure. And I think that, to kind of just talk about that a little bit more, as it's probably going to be something that is implemented soon, right? There'll probably be some regulations and compliances that are going to be announced whenever they catch up around using AI, right? So in an organization, as like you said, CISOs need to take the compliance as a framework and kind of build on it and kind of in some instances, right, you'll need the compliance to put like the example you gave to get to that point where you can create that that more secure policy within your organization. But let's take AI for example, or Chat GPT and all these chat services that people can use. If you don't put the compliance in or you don't put the policy in place, right, people will use it anyways, right? People are going to start using ChatGPT to put sensitive information, and if you don't put that policy in place or you don't put the controls in place, people might by accident put this information in. So you need, as a CISO, to kind of proactively address those concerns.
well, that's actually a good way to make a business case for, in this case, employee monitoring.
Right.
Because, for example, say, oh, I don't want you watching what I'm doing on ChatGPT. It's like, well, and I've witnessed this firsthand. If you happen to be a people manager and you need to fill out a performance appraisal, it might be like, okay, I'm going to upload what I think I was going to write to ChatGPT and then let ChatGPT tailor it and tweak it and make it better. And I'm sitting there watching this. I'm like, you do realize you're putting your employees' personal information, well, not their, like social security number, but you're putting information about your employees and you're uploading it to ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And for good reason, don't get me wrong, this is an example of a malignant threat. To make a better, more robust employee appraisal that can actually be more meaningful, good use in theory of generative AI. I hate the broad use of
Yeah.
AI,
Right.
because in this case, we're using, and frankly, we have to look at AI as really input and output.
Right.
AI is really just math. It's the algorithm that processes the input to the output, and these Dr. Evil quotes AI algorithms are really just different statistical, more advanced statistical types of algorithms that allow for better output, more exact output by taking in more parameters and doing better calculations with that.
Right.
In this case, we need to go ahead and say, okay, the problem isn't they're using generative AI. The problem is they're taking company data and uploading it to a SaaS platform that we don't have, that your company probably doesn't have an agreement with or control over. And so, therefore, you do need to go ahead and monitor that employees are using generative AI and LLMs
Right.
appropriately by not uploading data. So this is an example of, to be compliant, you have to be kind of intrusive to ensure that generative AI is being used appropriately.
Right.
So
And
anyway,
that
I don't know,
no, and
somewhere that's
that no, that's great. And it actually, like I said, it happens to segue to the next topic, which is, the future trends and what can we look forward to. So, you know, obviously with, the emerging technologies like AI, not just generative AI. What are some things that you're most excited about um, to advance insider risk detection?
so what I do like is the use of so, so I'm trying to answer this without just using AI generically. Let's
Right.
just say better mathematical models will help people do work better.
Hmm.
Better mathematical models will be able to filter out lots of activities users do and just highlight the bad activities. You can look at, for example, using cluster analysis, track, how somebody moves through the network and
Right.
be able to detect whether or not that user is the user because they're operating in a legitimate pattern across your network. Maybe you could say that person, and I'm not saying that person might be doing, the person could be doing good things in a more effective way. But if they are, the good part is if that person is more effective and behaving in a different way, doing things legitimately, we can take that pattern and train other users to use the same pattern because
Right.
that could make them more effective.
Right.
Because you can get better operational efficiencies because you can start to determine who are my better users and start to reward the better users who are operating more effectively, more efficiently, and reward them. And simultaneously, you can learn from their habits to make the other employees better and like
Yeah.
train them. It's like, well, we realize everybody has been doing things this way, but it would be better and more effective if you did it that way. And you
Right.
can only find that by analyzing patterns within there because, everybody's looking at, like, just for example, a product like Terramine for cybersecurity concerns. And yes, you can stop things cold if you're using a product like Terramind. At the same time, taking the same data as Terramind would have, you could theoretically write algorithms that can figure out how to make work more efficient by watching the people who are doing it, by analyzing how efficiently do people move through your network. You could also develop operational deficiencies and see where are people having roadblocks and how can those roadblocks be fixed and so on. And that's also a great thing to use this type of data for. So I'm kind of like really excited about the ability to, much like retailers figure out what's the exact ratio of products in each store location, we can start to look at what is the actual best way to implement work across our organization. Something else that's really critical, and I could tell an organization that's using AI properly or will use AI properly compared to one who's just doing lip service. And those are companies that have a chief data officer in place. Because to do AI effectively, you need to be able to integrate all the data across an organization, and a chief data officer is able to ensure the proper formatting of data so that it could be shared across the entire environment. And
Right.
that's what will allow the full exploitation of AI. And so, in the same ways for users and security, I'm
Hmm.
hoping we're able to start to be able to collect data so SIMs work better, SOAR works better, so false alarms go, we get rid of them, and that we can, because much going back to the Department of How versus the Department of No, by having a lot of this data, we can optimize an organization because a good cybersecurity program has cybersecurity embedded within all business processes,
Right.
not bolted on business processes. And ideally, good use of machine learning, clustering, LLMs, and everything like that can help for facilitating how can security be better integrated into the business.
Yeah, and that's something that, with Terramind, right? We are, our new CRO who joined in May, he sees Terramind as a data platform. It's just how we're presenting that data to you. So you can use it as a, a data to reinforce your cybersecurity decisions. You can use this data to reinforce your productivity decisions and your hiring decisions or your promotion decisions, whatever it would be. And that's all done within this one platform, which is, you know, I think what really differentiates Terramind from other insider risk or DLP solutions or even productivity solutions is that it's all in one place, right? We're collecting all this data and you know again touting Terramind's solution as the solution that has the ability to collect the most data. Um, and like you said, if you have a chief data officer in place that can utilize that data and take that data and you know use it to optimize productivity or and not just for those security purposes which are so valuable and so important, but also for the ways that you can optimize a team to become more efficient. I
Mhm.
really liked what you said there. So, as we're closing down, I have one more question that, I'd like to ask before we get to the Q&A section. Um, what advice would you give to a CISO or a security leader that would be, either starting at a new organization or is implementing their first, insider risk program or DLP program? What would you advise them and what steps to take?
So the best thing is always to create the proper quick use cases. Because obviously you need to first get this, product like Terramind into the infrastructure and start looking at the data and figuring out what type of data is most useful, where are the false positives and everything else. I like to break things up into how can you get a quick win and train your staff on how to use it properly. So by choosing the appropriate use case, by figuring out how to tune the collected data, because there are some things that are just going to become obvious. And frankly, with any new cybersecurity tool, I like to get quick wins. I have rarely seen a tool like Terramind being put in place that hasn't found, I'll be polite, a holy crap move,
Right.
something holy crap
An aha
that all of
moment.
a sudden, yeah, an aha moment, we'll use it that way, but that's an understatement. But I have always seen an aha moment once you turn on a new security tool that does some form of monitoring. So ideally, you look at that and you figure out, okay, how can I get that aha moment and what other aha moments can be found if that are similar to this? But then otherwise start to implement it in the appropriate way. Like start to implement it, for example, in places you can, like the natural place where you might want something like a Terramine might be on the remote workers. The reality is it might be easier to do a prototyping of the implementation within an office environment where you can control it, where everything's there, and then you can start to look at it. Then you could roll it out to like certain remote workers within certain categories and do things in a very piecemeal way. But if you
Right.
just throw this is just good project management at the end of the day to minimize risk, to go ahead and do things in a structured rollout that goes ahead in places you have the most control over, looking for the aha moments, and then going back and looking where else can we do things, and then finding out from other people what are probably the concerns I want to know about.
Right.
Like, for example, I did work with one company where they had, I was doing penetration testing, and they're like, we want you to go to this facility and do a test there. I'm like, I go there, we look at the network, and I'm like, why are we here? They're like, why are you asking? I go, because frankly, your network is crap. You've been hacked.
Right.
And they're like, why is this? I go, everybody has admin privileges on the system here. And they're like, why would that be? I go, there's two options. One is you have the worst net administrator in the world at this facility, or your system has been hacked. And they're
Right.
like, well, how do we know if we have the worst administrator in the world? I go, why am I here? And then they tell the story about a former salesperson who operated out of that office, who walked into a potential client and said, here is the proposal my old company is going to hand you tomorrow. Here is my new company's proposal, and here's why my new company's proposal is better than the proposal my company is going to give you tomorrow. And luckily, the customer reported that to the company that they had the situation, because they didn't know if it was a sting operation,
Right.
ironically. And so you'd be surprised how many people get turned in, not because the company, the victim or the benefactor wants to do well, but because it was like, this is too easy. There's got to be a catch. So anyway, I'm like, why am I here? And so in that case, they wanted to put something there to monitor that activity out of that office to figure out what was going on. So again,
Yeah.
that's how you roll things out.
Right. No, and it's interesting that you said that, starting it more in the controlled environment of the office setting versus the, remote setting, to kind of like we talked about earlier, is to establish those baselines, to establish, what we need to be keeping an eye on when and what not. And because we do have so many customers that start off with the use case of remote workforces, but sometimes we have those conversations with them as they're returning to office. You know, this is going to keep helping exponentially as you return because it's not just a security tool, it's a tool for productivity, it's a tool for, process optimization. So, you know, it was
Yeah.
interesting that you said start within the office.
Well, let me just say, maybe I'm an anomaly myself, but I am generally risk adverse to installing new software.
Hmm.
If I'm installing any new software product, I want to install it in an environment where, frankly, it's as controlled as possible, and also much more likely that I have people readily available to quickly respond.
Yeah,
For example, if I roll it out, and I'm not criticizing other people who do it a different way, but it's just my impression that if I roll out software first to remote workers, and either way, you're fully going to test it. But if there is a problem, it becomes all of a sudden your help desk gets flooded, and how much am I going to be able to control a help desk as opposed to having a team of a few IT people working with a handful of people sitting within 10-minute walk of each other.
right, right. So, Ira, this has been really great, and we have a few questions that came in from the audience. I'll start with the first one. I'm going to read it straight off the queue. On the use cases for workforce intelligence, the advisable practices are that you should be transparent with employees so that they trust how you'll use the data you collect. This is considered an ethics question. Would you agree, or is it better for security if it's not disclosed?
The issue is where and how it's disclosed. The fact is that, in my personal opinion, you are disclosing proactively when companies come to work for you that there is monitoring of some
Right,
form, actually in multiple forms that go on. They could watch they could watch when you log on your computer, when you log off. They could watch what systems you're accessing. They could watch just about everything. The use of a new tool, again, that's a question for, frankly, I mean, I don't like cybersecurity to answer these questions. And the reason I don't want cybersecurity to answer these questions is that we should have theoretical input, but the right people to answer these questions are the general counsel's office and HR offices.
right,
These are the organizations that are dealing with these type of things, because from a cybersecurity position, the best thing to do is install your tools. Don't let people know they're there so they can't bypass them. That aside, I do realize there is a moral slash ethical concern, which frankly, I might not know the full considerations of.
Yeah.
Ideally, a CISO is embedded within these teams to say, learn how decisions are made. And some companies are like, we just implement practices and this is how it's done. Some companies are much more of a diplomatic organization, perhaps, and like fully disclose everything and want to. That's somebody from a corporate culture perspective. That's
Right.
not the CISO to embed their personal thoughts, in my opinion.
Okay. So I hope, Stacy, that answered your question. Another question that came in was, how granular should the monitoring be? Um, wouldn't you be concerned about too many alerts or fatigue among your security teams?
Um, that goes into when you install, it should be tuned away. This
Hmm.
is like any other cybersecurity tool, whether it's going back decades, whether it's firewall logs, do you monitor every little alert that comes up? I mean, these are things where fundamentally the data should theoretically go into a, some sort of security orchestration tool, I would hope, and or a SIM or whatever the case is. And all these things are tuned out over time. Now, generally, the way to start is to get a finite set of data and then begin to add the types of data you collect, or to collect everything and then to flag only certain types of data and see where your false positives are theoretically coming from. But, this is all something where it needs to be tuned. It's not a matter of how much data is collected, in my opinion. At the end of the day, is how well tuned are your tools to take an event to turn it into an alert.
Let's see. So I have one more question, and I don't know if you can answer this, but I'll I'll um I'll share kind of what I think this person is asking, and I'll say this. In addition to Terramite, what other types of security tools should somebody be, supplementing with? Terramite is one tool. What are some of the other tools that they should, have in their security stack?
I mean, there's always good cyber. Everything comes down to good cyber hygiene, in my opinion, and I'm not
Hmm.
sure how they're looking to have the question answered. But you need anti-malware, you need web content filters, you need good, perimeter devices like firewalls or whatever they want to be called today to filter out lots of potentially malicious traffic. Because
Hmm.
the more you can filter out, the easier your life is, so you have less to respond to.
Right,
From a monitoring perspective, endpoint security is critical, where you should have theoretically looking at access controls, who's trying to violate, the identity access management type of
mhm,
things are always going to be there. Data leak prevention, web content filter should be there. There are new sets of tools. I mean, something like a Terramine does help supplement some of these tools, but there are new tools that are starting to prevent data being put into LLMs, as an
right,
example.
right,
And so at the end of the day, there's lots of tools I would ideally supplement. Then the question comes out, okay, where is my budget? And then
right.
how do I balance my available budget, which all the different tool sets I can be used and what has overlap. So in theory, if I'm watching something with Terramind, do I something like a LLM content filter might be less necessary. I'm
Right.
not saying I wouldn't try to have both, but it might be less necessary. So I need to do balancing of budgets with functionality.
Yeah. So as we have just 1 minute left, I just want to, I'll let you close it out, Ira, but I want to say thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you everyone who joined our webinar. So Ira, I'll let you close it out with the last word.
I really don't have anything to add. I mean, frankly, I'll just reiterate, good cybersecurity is good cyber hygiene. And
Hmm.
also, good cybersecurity is just good business and business process. And by embedding cybersecurity into business process by doing the monitoring and not just looking at security monitoring, but how can we create operational efficiencies? This is really where the benefit of cybersecurity tools can come from. That makes the CISO a hero of the organization and not just the department of how, but the department of what could be,
Yeah,
as opposed to the department of no.
right. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Ira, again. And we'll hope to see you guys on the next one. Take care. Bye bye.